On 14th October 1943, high over the industrial region surrounding Schweinfurt, Germany, a Luftwaffe pilot steadied his gloved hand inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-190. At roughly 15,000 feet, he entered another notation into the scuffed logbook strapped beside his throttle, an entry that, to him, resembled dozens before it. According to his tally, he had just claimed his 17th U.S. heavy bomber, a B-17 Flying Fortress that had dropped out of formation and spiraled downward, leaving a thick column of smoke marking its descent. Through the curved canopy, he could see the surviving American bombers trying to close ranks, their formations ragged and uneven after repeated attacks. The gunners aboard the B-17s loosed bursts of .50 caliber fire into empty air, hoping to deter German fighters that were already banking away to reposition. Years of combat had reduced the logic of such engagements to stark arithmetic. Fighters could dictate the fight, diving from altitude, firing at a moment of advantage, then withdrawing before the defensive guns could meaningfully respond. Deprived of long-range escorts, the four-engine bombers were, in effect, targets flying predetermined routes. That morning, 291 Flying Fortresses had crossed into German airspace on a mission to cripple the ball bearing plants at Schweinfurt, a strategic objective essential to German armaments production. By the time darkness settled over their bases in England, 60 aircraft would be missing entirely, and 17 more so badly damaged upon return that they were subsequently scrapped. Within the Luftwaffe, the engagement was described with grim satisfaction as an effortless massacre. Within the U.S. 8th Air Force, the day entered the record as Black Thursday, a catastrophe unprecedented in the history of American strategic bombing. Yet neither side, in that moment, grasped that this apparent German triumph marked the end of an era. Within 4 months, the balance of the air war would turn irrevocably. During the final months of 1943, German fighter units possessed a confidence that seemed fully justified. Veteran leaders, including Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, brother of the famed Adolf Galland, along with figures such as Major Walter Dahl, had refined interception tactics to a level approaching technical precision. Their methods, honed through extensive experience against U.S. heavy bombers, were designed to exploit predictable weaknesses in American defensive doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces relied on the concept of the combat box, typically comprising 18 to 21 B-17s arranged in a staggered, layered configuration intended to concentrate defensive fire. Each Flying Fortress carried an array of 13 .50 caliber machine guns, theoretically providing all-around protection. On paper, these overlapping arcs of fire formed a fortress in the sky. In practice, German pilots learned how to break the system apart by targeting the nose, where visibility and firing angles were limited, by forcing gunners to expend ammunition early, and by using sustained, coordinated assaults to undermine the cohesion and nerve of the bomber crews. The events of Black Thursday underscored those vulnerabilities with brutal clarity. What appeared to be a decisive German victory, however, preceded a rapid shift in the air war, one driven by the arrival of long-range escorts, changes in industrial capacity, and a mounting attrition the Luftwaffe could no longer replace. By early 1943, Hetman Heinz Kocha, then leading the 5th Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 11, had refined a method of attacking American heavy bombers that exploited the one direction from which the B-17 offered the least effective defense. His preferred tactic was the head-on assault, executed with meticulous precision. Kocha first demonstrated its lethality on 26 February 1943 when he brought down a B-24 Liberator known as Maisie. Over the following months, his tally climbed rapidly. By October, 17 four-engined aircraft had fallen to his guns. His approach followed a strict pattern: descent from high noon relative to the bomber formation, accelerate into a steep pass at roughly 400 miles per hour, release a brief 2-second burst aimed at the cockpit section and inboard engines, then roll away before the American top turret gunners could react. German strategists were emboldened by the results. The first Schweinfurt-Regensburg operation on 17 August 1943 showed the effectiveness of these concentrated fighter assaults. Luftwaffe units destroyed 60 U.S. bombers, around 16% of the attacking force, in a single day. Losses of this magnitude compelled the U.S. Army Air Forces to halt deep penetration missions for several weeks. When they resumed the campaign with the second Schweinfurt attack on 14 October 1943, the outcome was even more catastrophic. 77 bombers failed to return or had to be written off, and more than 600 American crewmen were killed or taken prisoner within the span of a few hours. Around this time, Major Gashab, the group commander of 2/JG-11, introduced another aggressive tactic, the company front attack. Flights of FW-19s would form a broad line abreast and drive head-on toward the bomber stream, presenting multiple simultaneous threats that overwhelmed the gunners' ability to prioritize targets. American crews described the psychological shock of seeing 8 fighters rushing toward them at an effective combined closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. With only seconds to identify which attacker posed the greatest danger, many gunners simply fired blindly into the oncoming formation. The fundamental vulnerability of the American bombing strategy stemmed from a practical limitation of 1943 aviation technology. No Allied fighter possessed the range to escort bombers deep into the German interior. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary U.S. escort weapon, could operate roughly 375 miles from base even with external drop tanks, a distance sufficient to reach only the edge of Germany. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had better range, but its engines and control systems were unreliable at the high altitudes and low temperatures of the European theater, where freezing conditions often caused failures at critical moments. As a result, American bombers were forced to undertake the most hazardous segment of their missions, the long stretch over central Germany, without friendly fighter cover. German fighter groups simply positioned themselves beyond the protective radius of Allied escorts and waited. Luftwaffe pilots referred to the moment the American escort fighters turned back as Die Golden Stunde, the golden moment. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, credited with 206 victories before his death in October 1943, later explained their routine in recorded interviews. According to Philipp, radar stations tracked the bomber columns and calculated the precise point where the escorts would break off and return to base. Once that occurred, German fighters would surge toward the unprotected formations. Bomber crews, aware of what awaited them, would instinctively tighten their defensive boxes, bracing for the onslaught. This asymmetry created a brutal form of operational mathematics. A B-17 formation might spend 4 hours inside hostile airspace, yet enjoy perhaps 90 minutes of meaningful escort coverage. Meanwhile, German fighters could attack, return to their fields, refuel and rearm, and intercept the same bomber stream again, sometimes repeating the cycle several times during one raid. Such repeated engagements significantly amplified the Luftwaffe striking power. Ironically, the fighter that would eventually close this deadly gap originated not from a U.S. military requirement, but from a British request. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation, seeking to increase production of Curtiss P-40 fighters. North American, instead, proposed designing an entirely new aircraft and promised to deliver a prototype within 120 days. That prototype, designated NA-73X, took to the air on 26 October 1940, an achievement in rapid development rarely matched in aviation history. Powered by the Allison V1710 engine, the first Mustangs demonstrated excellent speed and range at low altitude, but their performance dropped sharply above 15,000 feet, precisely the altitude band in which bomber escorts were required. The Royal Air Force therefore employed these early models primarily in tactical reconnaissance and low-level ground attack roles, where their endurance and maneuverability were genuinely advantageous. The dramatic shift that would eventually transform the strategic air war came only after American airframes were paired with British engine technology, a combination that neither nation originally envisioned but which proved decisive once implemented. In the spring of 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker took off in a Mustang powered by an Allison engine and came away convinced that the aircraft had untapped potential. The airframe impressed him immediately. Its design was unusually clean and efficient, in some respects even smoother than that of the Spitfire. What limited the aircraft was not its structure, but its power plant. Harker suggested that the Mustang be paired with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the two-stage supercharged engine then used in the newest high-altitude Spitfire variants. The proposal was taken seriously, and by October 1942, the first Mustang equipped with a Merlin engine took to the air. The improvement was striking. Top speed rose from roughly 390 miles per hour to about 440, but the real transformation occurred at altitude. Above 20,000 feet, where the Allison struggled, the Merlin-Mustang combination delivered strong, reliable power. The aircraft's service ceiling increased dramatically from approximately 31,000 feet to around 42,000. The collaboration effectively united American capabilities in mass production with British expertise in high-performance engine development, resulting in an aircraft that neither country, working alone, would likely have produced. Yet, the true breakthrough of the P-51B was not merely its higher speed or altitude performance, but its unprecedented combat range for a single-engine fighter. Three factors made this possible: a highly efficient aerodynamic design, especially its innovative laminar flow wing; substantial internal fuel capacity, 184 gallons, carried in a much lighter, more efficient airframe than contemporaries like the P-47; the ability to carry external drop tanks without suffering major performance penalties. The laminar flow wing, created under the direction of North American Aviation's Edgar Schmood, maintained smooth airflow far farther along its surface than conventional wings. This design reduced drag by nearly 30%, which translated into lower fuel consumption. While a P-47 typically burned around 100 gallons per hour at cruise, a Merlin-powered Mustang used only about 65 gallons at the same speed. These efficiencies became strategically decisive once external tanks were introduced. Early 75-gallon drop tanks gave the P-51B a combat radius of roughly 650 miles. The arrival of 108-gallon tanks in March 1944 increased that radius to about 850 miles, enough for a fighter to reach Berlin, engage enemy aircraft for a short period, and return to bases in England. No other single-engine fighter at the time could combine this range with comparable performance. The first unit to receive P-51Bs was the 354th Fighter Group, known as the Pioneer Mustang Group. They arrived at Boxted, Essex in November 1943. Although administratively assigned to the 9th Air Force, the group was almost immediately directed to support the 8th Air Force's long-range bombing offensive. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, had only a brief window to transition his pilots from their familiar P-47s to the new Mustang. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who would later lead the 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the initial familiarization flights. He later reflected that the difference was obvious as soon as the wheels left the runway. The Mustang responded sharply, flew faster, and most importantly, had the endurance the Thunderbolt lacked. The P-51B entered combat on 1 December 1943 during a fighter sweep over Belgium and France. A few days later, on 5 December, the aircraft flew its first escort mission, a relatively short-distance operation to Amiens. 16 Mustangs accompanied the bombers, not as the primary escort force, but as a controlled evaluation under combat conditions. No Luftwaffe fighters were encountered, but the sortie confirmed the Mustang's ability to operate effectively at high altitude. The next major step came on 13 December when the Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel, approximately 490 miles from their base, an undertaking previously impossible for Allied fighters. The sudden appearance of American escorts deep inside German airspace took many Luftwaffe pilots by surprise. Crews who expected to intercept unprotected bombers instead found themselves facing determined long-range fighters capable of meeting them far from the front lines. During the final days of December 1943, the 8th Air Force increased the tempo of operations to fully assess what the new fighter could do. These missions marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in the air war over Europe, as the P-51B proved it could reach targets once believed beyond the reach of Allied escort fighters. In late December 1943, the newly arrived P-51B units began demonstrating capabilities that neither the U.S. Army Air Forces nor the Luftwaffe had fully grasped only weeks earlier. On 20 December, Mustang escorts accompanied American bombers on a mission to Bremen and returned claiming 3 enemy fighters destroyed without losing a single aircraft. The Luftwaffe Air Defense Network, still operating according to assumptions formed before the Mustang appeared, continued waiting for the familiar moment when Allied escorts would have to withdraw westward for lack of fuel. But the expected withdrawal never came. At long distance, many German pilots initially mistook the approaching P-51Bs for P-47 Thunderbolts, and so assumed that the escorts would soon reach their operational limit and turn back. When the Mustangs instead pressed on deeper into German airspace, confusion spread across Luftwaffe radio channels. Messages intercepted by Allied listening stations captured ground controllers repeatedly questioning their pilots about what types of fighters they were seeing and whether their positions could possibly be correct. The idea that long-range Allied escorts had reached that far inside the Reich seemed implausible to them. One of the first German commanders to fully recognize the implications was Major Klaus Mitusch, who led 3/JG-26. After a 30 December encounter in which P-51Bs chased his formation nearly to the point of landing, he told his unit that the nature of the air war had shifted in a fundamental way. Their long relied-upon safe zones, he warned, were effectively gone. By 4 March 1944, the transformation was undeniable. At roughly 25,000 feet above Brandenburg, the American 8th Air Force carried out the first fighter-escorted mission to Berlin itself. Through scattered overcast below, the outlines of the German capital, long advertised by Hermann Göring as an inviolable fortress, were plainly visible. Above the city flew an immense formation of approximately 660 heavy bombers, protected on all sides by swarms of single-engine American fighters weaving defensive patterns. This flight marked a psychological rupture for the Germans as much as a tactical one. Leading the effort was Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, whose squadrons had only received their P-51Bs on 28 February. After merely 4 days of familiarization, they successfully completed an 1,100-mile round-trip escort mission that German planners had long declared impossible for any single-engine aircraft. For Luftwaffe pilots climbing to engage, the sight was astonishing. They had been repeatedly assured that Allied fighters lacked the fuel reserves to reach Berlin, much less to arrive in fighting condition. Yet these Mustangs appeared above the city with energy to spare, while German defenders, having taken off moments before, were already conscious of fuel limits that would shorten their engagements. The ensuing clashes were intense. More than 200 German fighters were committed to the capital's defense that day, but instead of depleted bomber gunners, they encountered highly capable Mustang pilots holding the altitude advantage. The 4th Fighter Group by itself reported 15 victories and, perhaps more importantly, disrupted multiple German interception attempts before they could meaningfully threaten the bomber stream.
For American airmen, the P-51B quickly became synonymous with a new era of air combat. Pilots frequently remarked that the aircraft combined speed, range, and maneuverability in a way no previous U.S. fighter had managed. Captain Donald Gentile, who would become one of the Mustang's best-known aces, later explained that the aircraft allowed them to chase down any German type, fight on nearly equal terms in a turning engagement, and remain with the bombers far beyond previous escort limits.
The cockpit environment itself demanded endurance. The P-51B's layout was compact but rationally arranged, with the Merlin engine allowing a comparatively unobstructed forward view, significantly better than that of the radial-engined P-47. Although the famous bubble canopy would not appear until the later P-51D, the B model still offered strong overall visibility. Pilots like Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 352nd Fighter Group recalled the physical strain of long-duration missions, hours spent on oxygen above 10,000 feet, severe dryness from the continuous flow of oxygen, persistent back discomfort from sitting on survival equipment, and constant vigilance as they scanned the sky for enemy aircraft. Despite these hardships, they understood that they finally possessed the means to protect bomber formations all the way to their deepest objectives. The arrival of Mustangs over Berlin forced an immediate reassessment within the Luftwaffe hierarchy. Hermann Göring is often quoted as having declared that he realized the war was lost the moment he saw evidence of P-51s operating above the capital. Although the exact wording of the remark is historically uncertain, the sentiment accurately reflects the shock among German leadership. Virtually every Reich defense plan had relied on the assumption that central German airspace lay beyond escort range. Consequently, training bases, manufacturing centers, and assembly facilities had been positioned far inland under the belief that they were safe. The P-51B shattered that foundation. American fighters could now strafe airfields near Prague, confront interceptors near Munich, and accompany bombers to virtually any point within Germany. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Major Günther Rahl, credited with 275 victories, later summarized the shift succinctly. The Mustang did not merely extend the bomber offensive, it fundamentally altered its nature. German units could no longer decide when to engage or disengage. The Allies dictated the terms of battle, and they could do so at will. The Luftwaffe experimented with numerous defensive measures as the air war intensified. One such effort was the creation of the Sturmgruppen, units flying specially modified FW-190s reinforced with additional armor and carrying heavy armament. These assault variants were intended to punch directly through Allied fighter screens and close in on the American bomber formations. In practice, however, their extra weight and reduced agility left them vulnerable to the far more maneuverable P-51 Mustangs that increasingly dominated the skies. The Germans also attempted large, coordinated strikes in which entire formations attacked at once, hoping massed fire and surprise would break the American escort. Yet the United States could field enough fighters, often with superior performance, to blunt even these concentrated attacks. From 20 to 25 February 1944, the unfolding situation became unmistakably clear. During this period, later remembered as Big Week, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, a sustained offensive aimed at disabling Germany's aircraft manufacturing network. With Mustangs now capable of escorting bombers all the way to their targets and back, the Americans conducted 6 days of relentless missions, roughly 3,300 bomber sorties and 3,673 fighter sorties. Although 226 bombers were lost, American air crews claimed the destruction of more than 500 German fighters. Far more damaging to the Luftwaffe was the heavy attrition among its trained pilots, losses that Germany lacked the capacity to replace. By early 1944, U.S. strategy had shifted deliberately. Bombers were no longer to be shielded at all costs. Instead, air superiority itself became the primary objective. General James Doolittle, newly in command of the 8th Air Force, issued a directive in January. Allied fighters were to engage the Luftwaffe whenever possible rather than remaining tied closely to the bomber streams. Pilots were encouraged to strike German air power at its source. Captain John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group later summarized the new philosophy. After escorting bombers to their release point, he explained, fighter groups would plunge to low altitude, sweep across airfields, and catch German aircraft either landing or attempting to take off. The aim was deliberate and systematic attrition, and the arithmetic of that attrition now favored the Allies decisively. German pilot losses reflect the shift. The Luftwaffe recorded approximately 1,311 pilots killed or missing in January 1944, 2,121 in February 1944, and 2,115 in March 1944. Many of these casualties were seasoned aces whose combat experience stretched back years. By contrast, the United States was producing roughly 11,000 new pilots each month, allowing it to absorb losses that Germany could not hope to match. The P-51 Mustang symbolized more than just extended range. It represented a broader American advantage in manufacturing capacity and technological innovation. Late in 1944, the introduction of the K-14 gyroscopic computing gun sight gave Mustang pilots a significant boost in accuracy when firing at maneuvering targets. By automatically adjusting for factors such as turn rate and distance, the K-14 allowed pilots to deliver far more reliable deflection shots. While the Mustang's 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns lacked the single-shot destructive power of German cannon, they offered other critical advantages: a high rate of fire and ample ammunition reserves. With 1,880 rounds available, nearly half a minute of continuous fire, P-51 pilots could maintain pressure in extended engagements. German fighters, whose cannon typically carried enough ammunition for a few seconds of sustained firing, had no such luxury. In drawn-out dogfights, Americans could afford repeated firing opportunities. German pilots had to wait for the perfect moment. Major Heinz Baer, credited with 220 aerial victories and regarded as one of Germany's most formidable aces, later reflected on the fundamental shift the P-51 represented. In his view, the Mustang was not merely another addition to the catalog of Allied fighters. It operated as a unified combat platform whose components were engineered to function seamlessly together. German units possessed excellent aircraft in various categories, he argued, but none that fused range, speed, reliability, and operational flexibility into a single system the way the P-51 did. Behind these assessments existed a scale of human suffering that remains difficult to fully comprehend. Thousands of very young airmen, many scarcely older than high school graduates, fought lethal engagements more than 6 miles above the ground in subarctic temperatures reaching -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Instant death, if it came, was considered fortunate. Others faced catastrophic burns, limbs torn away by high-explosive cannon fire, or the slow, helpless descent in parachutes punctured by rounds that left no chance of survival. Lieutenant William Wisner of the U.S. 352nd Fighter Group recalled an engagement on 8 March 1944 in which he downed Bf-109. The German pilot managed to eject, and his canopy deployed normally, yet the man was engulfed in flames. Wisner could only watch as the pilot attempted to smother the fire on his suit while drifting downward, a scene he remembered as one of complete helplessness, for no intervention was possible. German ace Walter Schuck of JG-7 described how air combat evolved in a remarkably short time. In 1943, he said, the Luftwaffe still imagined itself in the tradition of chivalric duelists, confronting bomber formations under conditions that seemed, if not equal, at least recognizable. By early 1944, that illusion had collapsed. American fighters, especially Mustangs, chased German aircraft from altitude all the way to their home fields. They remained overhead during landing attempts and struck as opportunities arose. According to Schuck, by that point, no place felt safe, not even the edge of the runway.
The psychological consequences were severe. Airmen who had been confident the previous year adopted an increasingly resigned outlook. Letters from pilots, later recovered from German archives despite wartime censorship, revealed an unmistakable decline in morale. One pilot wrote in April 1944 that takeoffs were effectively departures into expected death. The Americans appear wherever we go. They are higher, they fly longer, and they carry more ammunition than we can hope to match. With the arrival of spring in 1944, the Mustang's extended range made possible a sustained strategic campaign aimed at the very core of the German war economy, its synthetic fuel network. Facilities at Luna, Politz, and Brooks, previously unreachable by escort fighters, now faced repeated precision attacks with full fighter cover. The effect on the Luftwaffe was disastrous. Output of aviation fuel dropped from about 175,000 tons in April to 30,000 tons by July, and plunged further to around 10,000 tons by September. Training flights were drastically reduced before being halted altogether. New pilots arrived with barely 50 total flight hours, far below the 300 to 400 hours typically logged by American aviators. General Johannes Steinhau, then commanding JG-7, described the paradox that resulted. Germany possessed the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, capable of speeds near 540 miles per hour, yet there was scarcely enough fuel to operate it. He recalled watching rows of advanced aircraft sitting unused while Allied fighters conducted operations overhead with apparent freedom.
The contrast became starkly visible on June 6, 1944. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe launched only 319 sorties over France, while Allied air forces flew roughly 14,674 missions. Over the invasion beaches themselves, merely 2 German fighters appeared. Allied tactical and escort fighters, including Mustangs, had established a level of aerial dominance so overwhelming that the landings proceeded under virtually uncontested skies. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, was responsible for one of those 2 German sorties. Flying with his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Werdarsik, he carried out a lone strafing attack along Sword Beach. Priller later characterized the flight as a suicide assignment presented as an order. Their survival depended largely on the element of surprise. Allied pilots, encountering only a pair of FW-190s amid an airspace otherwise completely controlled by the invasion forces, reacted too late to intercept them. When the P-51 Mustang began flying deep into German territory, its mission quickly evolved from pure escort work to a far more aggressive role. Mustang pilots became highly skilled at low-level attacks, particularly against rail traffic. Their 6.5 caliber machine guns were powerful enough to tear apart locomotives, and the aircraft's ability to carry either a pair of 500-pound bombs or as many as 10 5-inch rockets turned it into a versatile and lethal strike platform. Among those who flew it was Captain Charles Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group, long before he became the first man to break the sound barrier. On 12 October 1944, Yeager achieved 5 kills against Bf-109s during a single sortie. Yet he later recalled the psychological weight of the mission shift. Once the escort role expanded, pilots were instructed to attack virtually any target of opportunity. Trains, vehicles, and occasionally transport cars that might have contained civilians all became part of the battlefield. Total war took on immediate meaning, and the Mustang's range ensured that no corner of Germany was beyond reach. Germany attempted to counter this pressure with radically new technology, introducing operational jet fighters such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. The Me-262, with a top speed of roughly 540 miles per hour, outpaced the P-51D by nearly 100 miles per hour, and, when flown by seasoned Luftwaffe veterans, could carve through American bomber formations before the escorts could react.
Even so, these late-war innovations were too few in number and arrived too late to change the overall balance. Adolf Galland, who flew the Me-262 with JV-44 in 1945 and scored 7 victories in the jet, later admitted that the situation was hopeless. He compared the defending German pilots to isolated big cats surrounded by a vast pack of adversaries. For every German jet, dozens of Mustangs waited above the airfields. The jet's primitive engines demanded gentle throttle inputs, long takeoff runs, and meticulous handling, making them especially vulnerable during climbs and landings. American pilots soon recognized these weaknesses and exploited them relentlessly. One of the most famous examples came on 7 October 1944, when Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group downed 2 Me-262s as they were lining up to land. Low on fuel and constrained by their fragile engines, the jets were unable to evade the diving Mustangs. Encounters like this became increasingly common as the war neared its end. By the opening months of 1945, Germany faced an unsolvable equation: too few aircraft, not enough fuel, and an ever-shrinking pool of trained pilots.
American production highlighted the imbalance. Over the course of the war, the United States built 15,486 P-51s, with roughly 8,000 operating in the European theater. At their peak in March 1945, the 8th Air Force alone fielded 14 Mustang-equipped fighter groups, more than 1,000 operational fighters. Germany, by contrast, could deploy perhaps 300 to 400 serviceable aircraft on a good day, spread across the entire Reich. Many fighters never left the ground because fuel reserves were exhausted, and countless newcomers entered combat with only minimal flight hours. The results were visible in the kill ratios. By 1945, Mustang units were routinely recording 10 aerial victories for every aircraft they lost. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who finished the war with 24 confirmed victories, all scored in Mustangs, commented that by that stage, the fighting hardly resembled traditional air combat. Allied fighters would locate German air bases, circle overhead, and destroy anything attempting to take off or land. The Mustang's reach essentially turned all of Germany into a continuous combat zone. After Germany's surrender, surviving Luftwaffe pilots provided candid assessments of the Mustang's influence. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland wrote that the P-51 fundamentally altered the air war. Until its debut in large numbers, German forces could often dictate the pace of aerial engagements. Once the long-range Mustangs arrived, that ability disappeared permanently. Major Heinz Knock, credited with 33 victories, was even more direct, asserting that the Mustang, not the bombing campaign or the Allied landings, was the decisive factor that broke the Luftwaffe. With an enemy fighter capable of penetrating as far as Poland and returning safely, German airmen found themselves hunted rather than hunting. The most striking accounts came from young pilots who joined the Luftwaffe late in the conflict. Many had fewer than 60 total flying hours when they were sent into combat. One captured pilot remembered encountering Mustangs for the first time in November 1944. They seemed to be everywhere, he recalled, realizing immediately that Germany had not only lost control of the skies, but had lost the ability to contest them at all. The Mustang's influence on the air war in Europe extended far beyond the immediate results of its missions. More than a tool for winning dogfights, it became the key instrument that allowed Allied air forces to carry out deep-range strikes with losses that commanders finally deemed sustainable. This capability opened the door to a deliberate and methodical dismantling of Germany's industrial foundation. Nowhere was this felt more sharply than in petroleum production, Germany's critical vulnerability. By the spring of 1945, output at synthetic fuel plants had fallen to a mere fraction of what the Wehrmacht required, roughly 10% of operational needs, leaving entire formations immobilized. the transportation system collapsed in parallel. Rail corridors, bridges, and marshalling yards were hit so repeatedly that the movement of reinforcements, ammunition, and raw materials became nearly impossible. Although German aircraft factories attempted to offset the bombardment through dispersal and improvised workshops, the effort achieved little. Airframes that did roll out of these facilities often sat useless, lacking both fuel to power their engines and experienced pilots to fly them.
General Karl Spaatz, who oversaw U.S. strategic air operations in Europe, later observed that the P-51 had effectively reshaped the nature of the conflict. In his view, the fighter was not merely supportive, but decisive. It made daylight bombing feasible, provided the air cover needed for the Allied return to the continent, and brought about the erosion of Germany's military capacity from the sky. Beneath these strategic consequences lay a quieter human dimension. Luftwaffe pilots who had entered combat during 1943 with confidence, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, found their outlook transformed as the war progressed. Those who survived long enough often recounted singular moments when they realized that Germany's fate was sealed. Nearly all of those memories centered on encounters with long-range American fighters appearing unexpectedly deep over German territory, places previously considered safe from escort fighters. For some German airmen, the transformation ran even deeper. After capture, many were struck by the contrast between Allied logistical abundance and the harsh rhetoric of Nazi propaganda. Encounters with humane treatment unsettled assumptions they had carried into the war, undercutting both morale and ideological certainty. These experiences contributed to a broader psychological collapse within the Luftwaffe ranks as 1944 and 1945 unfolded. In engineering terms, the P-51 marked a turning point. Its laminar flow wing, one of the most advanced aerodynamic features of its time, demonstrated how significantly drag could be reduced with the right airfoil design. Just as important was the marriage of British engine technology, most notably the Merlin power plant, with an American airframe. This partnership would stand as an early model for post-war transatlantic cooperation, a pattern later institutionalized through NATO and other defense alliances. The Mustang's extraordinary operational radius forced a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions about the role of fighter aircraft. Before the war, fighters were generally conceived as short-range interceptors tied closely to their bases. The P-51 proved that a fighter could serve as a strategic asset, projecting power across vast distances. This new conception influenced not only the next generation of jet fighters, such as the F-86 Sabre during the Korean War, but also modern designs that rely on aerial refueling to operate globally. The numerical record of the Mustang's performance is remarkable on its own. A total of 15,486 aircraft were built. In the European theater, Mustang pilots claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and 4,131 destroyed on the ground. They crippled German logistics by eliminating over 9,200 locomotives. The type flew more than 213,000 combat sorties and logged over 134,000 combat hours, while 2,520 Mustangs were lost in operations. The resulting air-to-air kill ratio, exceeding 11-to-1, remains among the highest ever achieved by a frontline fighter.
Yet the true weight of the Mustang's legacy cannot be captured by statistics alone. Its persistent presence over German skies broke the Luftwaffe's ability and ultimately its resolve to contest air superiority. It secured the conditions necessary for Operation Overlord, accelerated the collapse of German industry, and shortened the war in Europe by months, perhaps even longer. In technological, strategic, and human terms, the P-51 Mustang stands as one of the most consequential aircraft in the history of modern warfare. The speed with which Germany shifted from mocking unescorted American bombers to losing all practical control of its own airspace was extraordinary. What unfolded was not a gradual erosion of strength, but a sudden and overwhelming collapse. In the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe still appeared to dominate the skies above the Reich. Fighter groups routinely intercepted U.S. bomber formations and inflicted severe casualties, often with a sense of confidence bordering on arrogance. Yet within only a few months, everything changed. By March 1944, long-range P-51 Mustangs were accompanying heavy bombers all the way to Berlin. And by the summer of that same year, German air power had deteriorated so sharply that many formations were no longer capable of meaningful resistance. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in reality. As a fighting force, it had disintegrated. This rapid decline did not come in small increments. It was a chain reaction. Each Mustang-escorted raid struck at the system's foundations. Every experienced German pilot lost represented training that could not be replaced. Every downed aircraft reduced the Luftwaffe's already strained ability to prepare new air crews. Meanwhile, Allied planners, now confident in their escort fighters' range and performance, expanded their targets deeper into the German interior, accelerating the pressure. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943, Luftwaffe losses amounted to 2,967 fighter pilots. In 1944, that figure skyrocketed to 12,037. And in just the first 5 months of 1945, another 4,238 were gone. Pilot training times collapsed in parallel. Where airmen in 1943 often entered combat with more than 250 flight hours, early 1944 graduates averaged around 150. By the end of that year, replacements were arriving with roughly 80 hours. And by 1945, many were being pushed into frontline units after only 40-50 hours of flying. Combat inexperience became as dangerous as Allied firepower.
Perhaps the Mustang's most profound effect, however, was psychological. It upended the Luftwaffe's belief in its own technical superiority, exposed the overwhelming industrial output of the United States, and challenged the ideological convictions drilled into young German pilots. Many had been taught that democracies were inherently weak and that German engineers would always produce the world's finest weapons. Yet the aircraft dominating their homeland was American, sleek, fast, durable, and seemingly always present. By late in the war, the same pilots who had once ridiculed the idea of unescorted bombers were refusing to fly missions that amounted to suicide against Mustang-protected formations. Even seasoned aces struggled with the realization that the assumptions on which they had built their careers and their worldview were being torn apart in real time. 4 decades later, in 1985, a gathering of former American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, revealed how deeply the Mustang's impact had been felt. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who flew 116 Mustang missions and achieved 16¼ aerial victories, shared a table with Gunther Rahl, Germany's third highest-scoring ace. Raising a glass, Rahl acknowledged the decisive factor. To the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that turned the air war. We had good machines, skilled pilots, and we were fighting above our own soil. But the Mustang changed the balance completely. Walter Schuck, who flew both the FW-190 and later the Me-262 jet, offered a blunt summary. In a matter of months, we went from mocking defenseless bombers to hiding from Mustangs. I know of no other military arm that experienced such a total reversal so quickly. Johannes Steenhoff,
scarred from the crash of his Me-262 in April 1945, reflected on the Luftwaffe's misjudgment. In 1943, we dismissed the idea that America could build a fighter capable of reaching Berlin. The Mustang taught us how dangerous it is to underestimate an opponent. When asked when he realized Germany had lost the air war, Steenhoff's answer pointed not to a single moment, but to the dawning recognition that the skies above Germany were no longer theirs and would never be again.
In early March 1944, a moment arrived that many German airmen would remember with unsettling clarity. American P-51 Mustangs were suddenly overhead, circling above Berlin itself. That sight delivered a message more decisive than any official report. The Luftwaffe had already crossed the threshold from dominance to defeat. Only a few months earlier, in the autumn of 1943, German fighter crews had regarded unescorted U.S. bomber formations as little more than convenient targets. Their confidence rested on a long-standing assumption. No single-engine fighter could possibly accompany heavy bombers from Britain to the German capital and still have the endurance for battle on the return trip. It was considered a technical barrier, not an opinion. What they could not foresee was how rapidly American industry, engineering, and Allied cooperation would overturn that assumption. Between October 1943 and March 1944, the air war over Europe underwent one of the fastest shifts in advantage ever recorded. The Luftwaffe's skilled but increasingly exhausted pilots found themselves moving from the role of hunters to that of hunted. Their technical edge eroded, their numbers thinned, and the initiative slipped permanently from their grasp. At the center of this dramatic change stood the P-51 Mustang, not merely as a machine, but as evidence of what a democratic industrial system could achieve under intense pressure. The aircraft fused British aerodynamic insight with American manufacturing capacity, and it entered combat in quantities and at a speed that Germany could no longer match. The Mustang was not only fast and agile, it was available in the thousands, built by a society that had unified factories, laboratories, and resources with remarkable efficiency. German pilots who had been raised on the belief that democratic societies were inherently weak discovered the opposite. The United States proved capable of mobilizing its citizens, coordinating with its allies, and solving complex engineering problems with a scale and tempo the Axis powers could not equal. The range issue that had once guaranteed bomber vulnerability became, within months, a solved problem. Thus, when Mustangs appeared over Berlin on 4 March 1944, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Luftwaffe veterans would later describe that day as the point when their confidence broke. The realization was harsh. The enemy could now protect its bombers all the way to the heart of the Third Reich and still engage in dogfights with fuel to spare.
In post-war interviews, memoirs, and veteran gatherings, German survivors repeatedly cited the introduction of long-range American escorts as the turning point in the air campaign. Not the Allied landings in France, not the collapse of Germany's cities, but the moment when U.S. fighters demonstrated that they could operate far beyond what German planners had believed possible. Nearly 8 decades later, the Mustang remains one of the most recognizable symbols of American air power in World War II. Its presence in the European skies signified more than technological progress. It represented the culmination of industrial capacity, cooperative innovation between nations, and strategic adaptability. By the end of the war, many of the pilots who had once scoffed at American bombers were no longer alive to witness the consequences of their early certainty. The story of the P-51 illustrates a broader truth about modern industrialized conflict. Bravery and experience, while essential, cannot compensate for the inability to innovate quickly or produce enough advanced equipment. Victory increasingly belongs to those who can integrate new ideas, manufacture at massive scale, and respond to battlefield challenges with speed. By May 1945, the silence over Germany's airfields spoke louder than the confident predictions of 1943. The Mustang's arrival had not only reshaped the skies, it had extinguished the Luftwaffe's hope of regaining control. Its legacy endures as the aircraft that exposed the peril of underestimating one's opponents and demonstrated the decisive influence a single technological breakthrough can exert on the course of history.